Chapter 4. Back with the old gang. We found the 21st Regiment in its winter position at Gasht. It was horribly decimated. Only one company was still equipped with tanks. All the vehicles had been lost in fighting during the withdrawal of the infamous winter of 1941 to 42. "We've been waiting for you," came the greeting from our comrades. "Now show us what you've learned." They smirked in a conspirational manner, and we sensed something was up. We received the mission to take over the snow shovel details. These had to clear the way through the terrain in front of the tanks, during engagements in order to prevent them getting stuck. In the snow, our black uniforms in front of the tanks were a great deal. Contrary to all expectations, everything went well. Besides, we were certainly better off with our comrades who, in their panzer uniforms, were employed as infantry. Full of jealousy, we repeatedly saw how well Ivan was equipped in contrast to us. We were really happy when a few replacement tanks finally reached us from the home front. The 10th Company was completely resupplied with the vehicles, and I could finally take over my platoon. From March until the end of June 1942, we slugged it out in defensive fighting with the Russians around us and our winter positions at Gasht and east of Washma. We were then transferred to the area around Shishchuka, where we joined in the offensive fighting east of Bejeloj. I was put in for a promotion during the fighting, and a few days after the promotion something happened where I almost had to take my new shoulder straps off again. My platoon was positioned along a wooded trail. "Nice area," my driver said, and he was right. There was no visibility in front of or behind us, everywhere just trees and bushes. No man's land began on the other side of the trail. There was a pack next to us, somewhat offset. The few infantrymen were divided among us. The drivers and loaders of my 4 tanks had just gone to fetch their meal. My thoughts were already drifting to chow when the fireworks went off and the Russians attacked. Half of the crews were missing, no tank was ready for combat. I panicked at that point, slid into the driver's seat and backed off out of the woods. The other tanks in my platoon followed me in the belief that radio communications had failed. They were following the orders to exactly what the platoon leader's tank did whenever something like that occurred. After we had driven a few hundred metres, it was clear to me what kind of a mess I'd engineered. The pack crew and the handful of infantrymen had probably lost their nerves when they saw me bug out. I quickly turned around and returned to the old positions. Those great guys in the foxholes had held their nerve and had already repulsed their attack. "Man, what a bunch of heroes," the pack commander said. "If that's all you can handle, then you better be off not even coming to the front." I stood there with my tail between my legs and could only assure him that something like that would never happen again. That experience still weighed heavily on my mind for many days afterwards. How easy it is to make such a hasty decision. How badly it could have ended. I should have stayed there, of course, even if we weren't quite ready for combat. They had become clear to me after a few minutes. But the mistake had already been made when we had cranked up. This episode was a damn good lesson for me. I'd always reminded myself of it, especially when I had to pass judgment on subordinates. I was happy that I had the opportunity to wipe the slate clean. Before our units transferred to the area north of Oral, by doing that, I could at least wait for my promotion with a clearer conscience. Before I received my promotion, however, I was destined to get acquainted with a special area of operations. I became the leader of the engineer platoon in the headquarters company for a short time. Chapter 5. A Catastrophe. We were in our bunkers far behind the front. One morning, the commander called me in excitedly. "Hey, Curious, take a look. Just like in the movies. How is such a thing possible?" A newly equipped Luftwaffe field division advanced past our quarters on the way to the front. It took my breath away, just like a fairy tale. From the bread bags to the cannons, everything was new. We saw weapons we had only heard rumours about, the MG42, the 75mm long-barreled pack, and other amazing things. Certainly nothing could happen here. We wanted to believe that we would finally be able to completely refit our units as well. Everything that was rolling towards the front was a guarantee for a peaceful winter in this sector. Naturally, our company commander was itching to be able to see all the nice things up close, so we drove to the front lines to recon the situation. A dignified atmosphere prevailed. We thought we were in a training area. The non-commissioned officers wore their elegant visor caps, the troops were clueless and a bit bored in their positions. There were absolutely no signs of battle. Because of that, they had also packed away the MG42 so nothing would get into them. The comrades simply couldn't be convinced to demonstrate these previously unknown wonder weapons to us just once. An uncomfortable feeling crept over us. What would happen if Ivan were to attack there? Before these weapons were combat ready, the Russians would have already overrun these positions. Our fears would soon be justified. A door rolling from the northeast woke us one morning. We strained our ears for a few minutes. then nothing could keep us from our bunkers anymore. Outside, an icy snowstorm practically took our breath away and almost blew us over. This was ideal attack weather for the Russians. Without waiting for the alarm, we woke up the company. Our suspicions were confirmed. The report soon came in that the Russians had broken through. We found the commander of the Luftwaffe division in a state of complete despair at his command post. He didn't know where his units were. The Russian tanks had rolled over everything before the pack guns had fired a shot. Ivan had captured the brand new material, and the division had scattered to the four winds. Furthermore, the enemy stood fast after his quick initial victory. He feared a trap. Thus, with some effort, our regiment was able to seal off the breakthrough. It was a complete madhouse. When our infantry units marched up to a village, men in Luftwaffe uniforms waved to it. Shortly afterwards, they opened fire with devastating effectiveness. The Russians were wearing captured winter clothing. We thus received the order to shoot at every Luftwaffe uniform, since only Russians could be lurking in them. Unfortunately, a few of our own isolated assault groups also fell victim to this order. Whenever we heard an MG-42 hammer away in the next few days and weeks, we could bet our lives on it that the Russians were firing it. We still hadn't used one in action, and our foot soldiers usually had to be contented with capturing Russian weapons. We all became enraged whenever we thought about the failure of those responsible. They put the best weapons into the hand of commanders inexperienced, poorly trained troops and threw them straight into the front. How well we could have used men and material intelligently employed in the following weeks in the offensive and defensive fighting, south of Bajok, Kolensk, and Shishinsky. I survived a particularly nasty action as a newly baked lieutenant and an engineering platoon leader. We had the mission to clear the mines ahead of the tanks. I was amazed that I got away with only a superficial flesh wound on the hand. I then started to appreciate the work that was demanded from our engineers. I was happy when I was transferred back to our old first company. I saw August Deller again, my old tank commander. He had become a feeble wheeler in the meantime, and naturally we rode together in the same platoon. The operations we jointly participated in brought about great losses to our battalion since the beginning of the campaign. The Russians employed great quantities of AT rifles, which penetrated our tanks with ease. Our losses were very high. Many of the comrades were mortally wounded in their tanks, or could only be evacuated with serious wounds. We were completely helpless in nighttime engagements. The Russians let us approach quite close, and by the time we recognised them, it was much too late to defend ourselves, especially since an exact laying of the tank site was impossible at night. The feeling of being practically defenceless got to us. Fortunately, the first 75mm long-barrelled Mark IV Panzers and the more heavily armoured 50mm long-barrelled Mark III Panzers started to arrive in small quantities from the home front. This was the silver lining on the horizon, a lining which would so often let our hopes be revived in Russia. After practically giving up hope and losing all confidence in our own vehicles, we again gathered some courage and made it through the last unsuccessful attack through Ploshkaya and Belgorod. In the meantime, it had become January 1943. I was supposed to take my home front leave before the upcoming leave cancellations. On the evening before my departure, August Deller motioned his tank out of its box. It had been dug into the earth to ward against the enormous cold. Deller slipped on the smooth sloped ramp with his felt boots and slid in front of the left track of the vehicle. It grabbed him without his driver noticing it. The tank was immediately brought to a stop when the remainder of the crew yelled, but the track had already rolled up to Deller's upper thigh. He was killed immediately, without ever uttering a sound. I had lost one of my best friends. I was then really ready for leave and looked forward to home and my parents' house. But it seems as though I was not supposed to enjoy my time there. A telegram soon arrived announcing my transfer to the 500th Replacement Battalion. Disappointed, I kept on guessing why I could not return to my old company. I reached Putlos with mixed feelings and with certain expectations of having to go through another gunnery course. I would much rather have returned to my old gang at the front. Not until I reported to headquarters did I discover that officers with frontline experience and a few companies from the Eastern Front were supposed to be trained there on a new type of tank, the Tiger. The news spread like wildfire, and yet no one knew anything specific about it. We got a view of a few of its precursors from development, but we didn't like them very much. Hauptmann von Luchau was supposed to be leading the training. I knew him from Russia and didn't think it was very nice of him that he had saddled me with the job of running the officers' club. There was probably no more junior officer to be found, therefore I couldn't change anything Mistuo. That this job would bring me luck was something I didn't discover until later. We went to Paderborn, the home of the 500th Replacement and Training Battalion, which was later responsible for all units with Tigers. As the club officer, I met Hauptmann Schober. He had come from Russia with his company for retraining. Von Lucio had given me strict orders to accommodate Schober's every wish concerning the allocation of alcoholic drinks. They were both close friends. Schober liked to drink a drop or two now and then. He showed me up at my location almost daily, since I had to control the scarce supplies. We thus came to know and respect one another. I had the feeling that he liked me, and not only because of his special allotment of French vermouth. We often sat together with the men of his company as well. I was especially happy when he asked me one day, "Curious, how would you like it if you were to come to my company?" "Yes, sir, right away, sir." I could scarcely believe my luck. Only 2 companies were initially being organised. At most, only 6 men were required from the entire group of officers, and I was one of them. On my recommendation, Schober took Oberlieutenant von Schiller for his executive officer. I knew him from the 21st Regiment. I was finally relieved of my post as the club officer soon after my transfer to the new company. Schober had consumed quite a bit. One must also consider that he had also supplied the company with spirits in the process. When a few bottles were demanded for the reception of some sort of higher up, I had to respectfully report that there wasn't a single drop left. Oh well, my successor didn't need to accept any stock. The transfer was easy. I could begin to devote myself entirely to the company. When Schober introduced me to them, I couldn't help but recall the comments made by my fellow travellers. When I was called up, I will never forget the eyes made by Hauptfeldwebel Rieger and Oberfeldwebel Delzit. They later confessed their first impressions of me. It could be summed up in the following statement. "Man Sepp, what kind of little fart did the old man dredge up?" Naturally, it was difficult to find trust in a combat company as an outsider, but everything went well. Even before our departure to France, we were supposed to get our tigers. I had become very tight with those guys, as if we had always been with them. Unfortunately, Hauptmann Schober was summoned to take over a battalion. His departure speech stayed with me for a long time and became an inspiration to me. He requested the men to show me the same trust as they did to him. I dedicated myself heart and soul to my duty. After a few months of training, we had surpassed the other companies in the battalion with regards to our success. In the process, we had the least number of mechanical failures. I had not dared to hope for what when Schober handed over the company to Hauptmann Ratke, and Hauptmann Ullmann led the 3rd Company. The 1st Company had been collecting experience as an experimental company in the northern sector of the Eastern Front since the autumn of 1942. After our activation, we were supposed to follow them into the area around Leningrad. Chapter 6. In Brittany. Initially, however, we headed west, to Ploermel in Brittany. The company was directed to an abandoned and neglected chateau. The company commander and the executive officer lived by themselves in the city. I preferred to live with the company. We had to get to know one another. If we were supposed to go into action together, the company never forgot what I did. I gladly took all the unpleasantries aside that I had to accept in the small, musty room of our castle. The fun began as soon as we moved in. We had to put the old stables in order before we could be expected to live there. There was neither a wooden floor nor wooden planks. For the time being, I wanted to get hold of a few bales of straw for my men, but in the neighbouring farm they refused to give me anything without a receipt from the local headquarters. I thus drove to the headquarters in the city, where they had already closed up shop. I promptly filled out the certificate to the farmer myself, so he could file a complaint with it. Just as promptly came the dressing down from the battalion. If we hadn't departed from the Eastern Front soon thereafter, they would have probably saddled me with the proceedings for plundering or something similar. After the war, I often had to think about that whenever I saw how easily the French occupation troops simply covered their needs through us. During this period, I also had to add a war crime to my conscience, an execution without trial or judgment. I saw the next one up during live firing at the edge of town, when the rooster of a neighbouring farm ran straight across the range. More than likely it had been directed from the farm, and animals were supposed to be penned in during the firing. I had just taken aim when the rooster crossed between me and the target. The commander yelled something out, but it was too late. I couldn't help myself. I gave up the target rings to make the rooster a source of amusement for us all. I made a few somersaults, and then it became something scarcely edible. The company commander was already giving me a huge dressing down when the grieving owner of the dearly departed also came running up. Even with the money, she couldn't be calmed down, since the deceased had plainly been the best rooster far and wide. Of course, the red wine was a part of our stay in France as well. The Austrians in the company were especially partial to it. There were hardly an evening where I didn't have to get up again and put my Austrians to bed. The charge of quarters usually wasn't able to impose lights out, since more than half of the company were non-commissioned officers who pulled duties drivers, gunners, and tank commanders. I almost always had to personally announce closing time, but usually that didn't happen until I had drained the glass offered to me and licensed to a Viennese song. We didn't take the obligatory drill and ceremonies too seriously. We simply went through the motions whenever a superior came into view, so it wouldn't stick out too noticeably. Besides, I was happy to be able to experience a few carefree days before we went back to the front. Soon the transportation details were formed to fetch the Tigers from Germany. One of these details was entrusted to me. I had a layover in Paris both coming and going. The city and its inhabitants were very interesting to me, although it was difficult to get a conversation going with them. I admired the attitude of the French, God knows. They had lost the war, but not a word was said against their own soldiers. They also refrained from any type of criticism against us. To dirty one's own name after losing a war seemed to remain a trait of the Germans. Our troops in Paris acted as if the war had already ended and been won. Their behaviour was unbelievable to me. I wasn't able to forget that in a few weeks we would be slugging it out on the Russian front once again.